Good evening. Welcome to the Bible Speaks Today. I apologise for the small break at the moment, and you probably heard the loud voice of my producer saying, "Okay, get a move on." I just felt the need for a swig of coffee at the most inopportune moment. This is the Bible Speaks, and I am Tony Baxter, but you knew that because you watched the credits, and if you didn't, you've watched the programme before. And if you didn't watch the programme before and this is your first time, well, welcome, and I'm still Tony Baxter. Okay. We are continuing with our series called Preparing the Way, which is talking about what came before the King James Bible, for which so many people hang their hats on today. And we've done similar short studies about this subject over the last year or two, but we haven't really got into it in any depth. And it's always a good idea with anything, your life, your country, what your religion is, to look back where you came from. Sometimes it's a great advantage, certainly a great help, to realise how much has been achieved or how much has been lost over any great period of time. If you look back on a country and how it's grown and prospered, or how it's not grown and not prospered, to measure what you've lost, as they say. Or gain. Not being too negative about it. Anyway, so we were talking last week about the two gentlemen who started the whole Bible translation rolling in a big way, Wycliffe, and then 100 years after him, Tyndale, and more of them in a minute. But I finished up last week by saying that they were moved by what they considered as social needs. Now, nobody looks back at the 15s, 13, 14s, 1500s and talks and thinks about social movements. We think we, today, are the great social generations, starting perhaps, in the early 1900s, with our caring of other people and our welfare systems and our social services and everything else. And we think back, think that we've really the first generational group, or 3 or 4 generations of groups that have really thought about this. And it's nothing could be further from the truth. Back in 1300 and 1400, there were a great many people who were concerned about the welfare of the ordinary citizens. As education becomes more and more attractive, or more and more more and more people can get access to it, accessible education, then by and large you begin to understand about where you are in the relationship with other people. I mean, up until that period of time, you were the peasant, he was the lord of the manor, and that's the way it was, and there was no changing. If you were a peasant, you were a peasant. You were born a peasant, worked as a peasant, died as a peasant. There was no changing your stature in life. There was no going to school, getting an education, becoming a schoolmaster or a banker or a lawyer or something. That was reserved for the gentry, not for you. You plough the fields and scatter, And it's an interesting conceit, if you will, that we think that nobody in those times cared for social needs, and yet these two people did. The Bible is a great instrument in that respect. Okay? And many of our forefathers were greatly concerned about, the effect of people and how we weren't living, being very Christian, and how we should handle things. So Wycliffe in the 14th century, and Tyndale in the early 16th, so 100 or so years apart, were two of these kind of people. And the first English translations of the Bible were because of a great social impulse. It wasn't that, wouldn't it be nice to have a Bible in the English language? It wasn't that the faith would increase and everyone would come to Jesus and everything would be wonderful. That wasn't the main reason. The main reason was to try and erase some of the social gaps that existed. Wycliffe was according to his writings anyway, was despairing of the great gap there was between the church and the people. The church was this rich, ornate body of people over here that owned half the country or more, and the people who had nothing, grubbing their existence. The Church of England, and we're talking about the church in England now, was the wealthiest land owner in the country, even more than the king. Much more. That's why Henry did what he did when he disestablished the churches, because they were a lot richer than he was. That's for a later program. But the church and the laity, the church rather, and the church officials and the priests, they all lived to a reasonably high standard, and the peasantry just got on as they could. The lords and ladies the same way. It was a great social chasm, and Wycliffe felt that a wider and fuller knowledge of the Bible would help both sides. Perhaps if the church understood its Bible more clearly, instead of learning it by rote, and perhaps if the peasant or the lower class people could understand what the Bible meant to them and what God intended for us to be, then it would help to close this huge big gap. In other words, Wycliffe believed that the cure for the evils of religion was more religion. Now, I sometimes have a problem with that, but I understand where he was coming from. I would say more intelligent religion might be a better way of putting it, okay? He found a lot of resistance, and it came down to this, that the resistance that he got from people was based on this sort of thought, that the best things in religion should be kept from most people, because then it would upset the balance of power. Today we have dictators in countries who try and repress women from education, who try and repress education from anybody. They try and repress outside influence. In China today, the information that people can get from European or American press, from newspapers and things, and books and things like that, is strictly controlled, because the powers that be feel that if people get to read what other people are saying about the situation they're in, or get to understand that, hey, we're the people, we have the power to change this if we want to, then you've got all sorts of rebellion problems and people arguing about things, and we really don't want that, so we'll just repress it. And it was the same thing with the religion. Religion was much more a political arm in those times, 14, 15, 1600s, excuse me, than it is today. Now, religion is still used in politics today. You've only got to watch your evening news to see that, excuse me. As I say, you've only got to watch the evening news to see how much religion is used in a political sense. But back in the time of Wycliffe, religion was people didn't subscribe to political parties, they subscribed to their religion. If the Pope said jump, you said jump, and which way, So, as I said, there was a considerable movement to stop the translation, not so much because it was a translation, but it might give people ideas above their station. And where have you heard that before? Okay? Wycliffe felt that even though that was a possibility, people should know more about what was expected of them. And if they did handle it a bit carelessly, or and misread it sometimes and made mistakes, it was better than being shut out of it completely altogether. If you think about it, the English translation of the Bible is really an emancipation thing of the mind, and political too, as I said. It really opens up people's minds to what could be, what should be, what used to be, if you like. Okay? But his other purpose too was to reach and sort of push the common idea of the Bible into a more fundamental truth of religion, not the highfalutin about how much you should pay and what you should do for the priest, this sort of thing, but the truths of it, the basis of the Bible. I mean, what is the Bible to you? I mean, is it your rule book? In other words, okay, I need to know whether to buy a new suit of clothes. What does the Bible say about that? Or is it an inspiring book where it inspires you to live the kind of life that God wanted us and made us to live? If you ask people back in the 14th century, what does God want you to do? They would have absolutely no idea. I don't know, whatever the priest says. Okay, but when you start reading the Bible, you suddenly think, oh, Jesus, Old Testament, you read that, and then you read the New Testament, what Jesus wants us to do. Oh, I see, it's all become clear now. The other thing that Wycliffe's concerned about really is that he wanted to give the Bible, the common people, the full text of the Bible. Now, as I said, there were bits of the Bible translated out much earlier than this. We know that. And there's still bits of it in museums and things. But he wanted them to read the Bible, because in reading the Bible they educated themselves. Even today, reading the Bible is encouraged in some, let's say, second world or third world countries. Reading the Bible and or reading the Quran, because that's done a lot too, not that that's in second or third world countries necessarily, is a way of educating people. You learn grammar, you learn syntax, you learn context, you learn structure. You can learn all these things by reading something like the Bible, or in this case of Islam, the Quran. And by reading it, you become a much more rounded person. You get ideas. If you've got no idea of what a concept is, then you don't get it, right? If you never thought of reading and writing or passing it on to somebody else, the thought of being a teacher or a preacher or something like that would never occur to you. Just carry on ploughing the land. Now you start to read, you start to understand, you start to comprehend, you start to get, in the case of the people in those days, ideas which have been considered above their station. What do you mean? You're a ploughman. You can't learn to read, write, and teach. That's not allowed. Now, Wycliffe's translation, of course, was from the only Bible that existed at the time in print, and that was the Latin Vulgate. Okay, so he translated the Latin Vulgate. And in 1382, which is what, 600 years ago, 500-600 years ago, there was the first translation, complete translation of the English version of the Bible, all of it. Okay, with any of the errors that might have been in there in the Vulgate, translated out, and with presumably some errors in translation included in it, because I guarantee you it's almost impossible to translate from one language to another without including some errors. And the English people, not saying particularly chosen by God necessarily, but the English people is the first of what we call the modern nations, the modern nations of today that we understand, that were given the Bible in their own familiar tongue. And what's interesting is that once they got it, they'd never allowed it to be taken away. The same for in this country, in America. Once people get hold of the Bible, they fight tooth and nail to hang on to it. You'd have a hard job recalling all the Bibles today, wouldn't you? People say, oh no. And this is in the days, of course, before printing, so everything was done by hand only. Yet, we weren't so many people around at the time. That's one thing, and we're not trying to print enough copies to do the 5 billion people in America or how many we got right now. But back then, societies were smaller. Not tiny, but certainly a lot smaller. But still, a huge number of these Bibles were actually copied out by hand. Now, I don't know how long it took to copy out a Bible. How long do you think it would be taking your Bible, the one you use, whatever model it is, to copy it out by hand all the way? Weeks and weeks, I would think. Even with modern, I'm not talking about printing and copying on the computer, I'm talking about handwriting it out. But, there's probably, I looked around the other day, I tried to count it up, there were some references in one of the books. There's probably 150 or so original manuscripts, part of them or whole of them, still in existence. And I think there's 10 or 12 that are the original copies, not copies of copies, if you know what I mean. And then people did revisions where they realised that there'd been a mistake made here, made a mistake there. One of Wycliffe's disciples, John Purvey, made a couple. There was a couple that belonged to. One was Queen Elizabeth, Edward. One belonged to Edward VI and Queen Elizabeth. Those copies are still in existence in London in the museums, and they show like they've been used. They're not, like not dog-eared. They're dog-eared and thumbed and been used. Okay. So, 20 years after it was first done, the Bible's getting out there, and being made very, very popular. Copies, people are busy copying them. I was trying to think what the price was. I think I read somewhere that a copy of Wycliffe's Bible could be had for the equivalent to us of $120, $200. If you multiply that by 10, because of the what the money's worth, we're talking about something. People were buying Bibles for $1,000 at that time, when money was not so easy to come by. But anyway, the other thing about the Bible is that its translation became the standard of Middle English. In other words, of the English language. If you had a grammatical question, but no grammar books written at this time, okay? So if you had a how do you say this, or what's the correct form of a sentence, or how do you pronounce this word, it was in the Bible. That was how you got your structure. So the Bible was not only the religious handbook of the time, it was also the grammar handbook at the time. In other words, the Bible was not only opening people's minds to what God said and what God wanted us to do and how we should live and how we should treat each other and how we should worship Christ, but also how to write the stupid stuff down. It's an amazing piece of kit. And it established that principle of English grammar, if you will. And the other great thing happened in 1400s, was the invention of the printing with the movable type thing. So when Gutenberg, and you all know that name, in 1450 something, when Gutenberg did his first book, which is a copy of the Vulgate, okay, the invention of that printing. Now, the first printing was in Latin, obviously, the Vulgate Bible. But as soon as people realised it could be printed, right, then it became a matter of great expediency to get the English language Bible out there in the language. And you can see how it affected the use, because it made it worthwhile to learn to read, because there's something you could read. There was no other book, as far as I know, at the time in the Anglo-Saxon language. They came very quickly afterwards, but initially, if you wanted to learn to read, the book to read was the Bible. You couldn't go down to W.H. Smith's and buy half a dozen paperbacks to read. The only thing available was the Bible. So the Bible, in fact, in those early days, was probably more widely read and studied than it is today. It's an amazing thing. Now we've got a book that you can print and somebody who can read it. And almost 100 years after the death of Wycliffe, William Tyndale was born. Wycliffe had felt a social need for the popular version of the Bible, but Tyndale had a kind of different attitude to it. He saw the need as great a need among the clergy as there was among the laymen. one of his comments, I want to read it out to you. So, yeah, if you will not let the layman have the word of God in his mother tongue, yet let the priests have it, which for the great part of them do understand the Latin at all. In other words, the priests didn't understand the Latin, and yet they had the only access to it. But sing and patter all day with lips only that which the heart understandeth not. So, the priests are there reciting the Latin by heart, couldn't read it, and the clergy didn't have it, or it was in less plentiful supply. So Tyndale felt that there should be a revision and a much better translation so that both sides could get together. A priest in those days went to a seminary and got told what the party line was, and he spouted that out. He had no knowledge or any ambition to study the Bible and seek it out for himself because he couldn't read it, the Latin or anything else. Okay, so Tyndale published a version of the Bible and got it out there to the clergy. So now people are beginning to read and understand and discuss. Now this is dangerous to the ruling classes. People are saying, they make these laws that sort of favour them, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing, is it? We started, and then now the Bible becomes used as a political weapon, which it's still been doing today, isn't it? Go and read your Facebook tomorrow morning, you'll see what I mean. Okay? So, going back on what I was saying about the priest, here's an interesting sideline. 40 years after Tyndale published his Bible, right? 40 years, quite a long time, the Bishop of Gloucester, a gentleman called Hooper, Bishop Hooper, made an examination of the clergy in his diocese. He called all the clergy in, or went round to them, I don't know which, and he said there were 311 of them, 311 priests in his diocese. Okay? He said 168 of them, more than half, could not even repeat the 10 Commandments. I mean, that's a priest. 31 didn't even know where they could be found in the Bible. 40 could not repeat the Lord's Prayer. Now this is basic stuff, folks. All right? And nearly as many who did not know where the Lord's Prayer originated. Yet they were in regular standing as clergy in the Diocese of Gloucester. So you can see the need for a Bible in their own language, right? Absolutely. So about 1500 and something, 1520 something, Tyndale began to put the scriptures into the current English. Now it's 100 years later than Wycliffe, so the language has changed a little bit. Different words mean different things. And the final revision was put in about 1830 something, okay? And that's kind of a notable year because in 2 years they put him to death, strangled and burnt him. Because, this was done with the church and the state feeling that he was fomenting rebellion. So they burnt him. In fact, later on in life they dug his bones up and burnt them again. Show how really they felt. But the thing about Tyndale is he is, against all the odds, Tyndale is the real father of the King James. 80% of his Old Testament and 90% of his New Testament are transferred to the King James. In other words, in the Beatitudes, I read some, where is it? Okay, in the Beatitudes, 5 of them are word for word the same in the 2 versions, and there's only slight grammatical changes in the others. 9/10 of the words in the New Testament translation we have today, the King James, are Tyndale's. And in the longer epistles like Hebrews and that, almost 5/6. So basically, Tyndale was the translation of the Bible from which the King James translators took their information and from which gives us the King James of today. So we have to thank gentlemen toiling under somewhat difficult conditions, being persecuted and reviled and just generally made to feel just really bad about everything. They're the people who, because of all their work and because of all their feelings about a social need, came out eventually with the Tyndale version of the Bible, which in fact although the King James scholars were tasked to look at all the different Bibles, and if you've been watching me a year or so ago, we did a program about that particular formation of the King James, but up until that started, the King James we have today is 90% the Bible translated by Tyndale back in 1500 and something, okay, which itself was a translation of Wycliffe's, which itself was a translation of the Latin Vulgate, which itself was a translation of the Septuagint, which itself, and so forth and so on. So they're all coming right up through. And from King James, of course, we've gone on since then to, you know, the Revised International, the Message, the Reader's Digest version, all those sort of things. But the Bible has progressed on and become more and more popular. There's scarcely a home in America, I would think, doesn't have at least one copy of the Bible somewhere in it. Okay? So you can see that it took hundreds of years for us to get to just the King James. What's going to happen in the next 500 years? What sort of Bible will we have then? Presumably we'll still have the same basic facts or whatever it is, but it might be in a completely different format. We don't know, do we? So, I encourage you, read your Bibles because it's a very precious book. And think about how long it took and how difficult it was for it to reach us as it is today. And until next time, God bless.